Welcome to this program in the Our Finger Lakes History series. I am Seneca County historian Walter Gable. This program deals with the Holocaust refugee camp at Fort Ontario in Oswego, late in World War II. It is the story of almost 1,000 refugees of assorted European nationalities brought to Fort Ontario in Oswego from Italy by order of President Franklin Roosevelt in 1944 during World War II. As stated in the book Token Shipment, the story of the emergency refugee shelter at Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York, is the story of almost 1,000 refugees, of which most but not all were Jewish, who were brought to the United States. They were the personal guests of President Roosevelt until very early in 1946. They lived there for 18 months on the shore of Lake Ontario in an abandoned camp at Fort Ontario, with this camp administered by the War Relocation Authority. Although there were thousands of Europeans who wanted to escape the atrocities of Nazi Germany, this was the only such refugee camp established in the United States during World War II. How this safe haven came about is the subject of this program. On the grounds that comprised historic Fort Ontario, but outside the fort itself, today is the Safe Haven Refugee Shelter Museum. This museum keeps alive the story of the Fort Ontario residents who were refugees from the Holocaust. Once again, I say this Safe Haven Holocaust Refugee Shelter was the only Holocaust refugee facility in the entire United States during World War II. Hopefully, everyone watching this program is well aware of the atrocities of Nazi Germany during World War II, especially the Holocaust. Throughout most of the war, the United States basically closed its eyes to the genocide that was taking place in Europe. There were millions of refugees desperately seeking to escape the Nazi German regime, but the United States was strictly enforcing its limited immigration quotas enacted in legislation in the 1920s. But late in the World War II, the Franklin Roosevelt administration could no longer ignore the horrific stories from survivors of Nazi concentration camps. It was on June 9th, 1944, just a few days after the famous D-Day invasion, that President Franklin Roosevelt announced publicly that a refugee shelter was being established in the United States. Franklin Roosevelt said that the refugees would come to Fort Ontario and not according to existing immigration restrictions and regulations. Instead, basically these refugees would come to the United States as guests of the President of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt said to Congress on June 12, 1944, that these sheltered refugees would be returned to their homelands in Europe after the war ended there. Roosevelt, in his announcement, made statements that have strikingly similar aspects to our Mexican border immigration problems today. Shown here is a refugee facility at Ferramonte in southern Italy. It became a relocation center for displaced persons, some of whom came to safe haven here in Oswego, New York. Two basic facilities in upstate New York were being considered as relocation facilities for the refugees from Nazism that were to come to the United States. The War Relocation Authority was in charge of relocating refugees to the United States. The Fort Ontario site shown here was selected rather than the Madison Barracks in Watertown, New York. The War Refugee Board had to determine criteria for which of the many refugees from Nazism would be selected to be brought to the United States. The criteria formalized were as follows. Number one, no families with healthy males of military age. 2, no families with members with contagious or loathsome diseases. 3, no separation of family groups. 4, as many as possible from the already existing refugee camps in Europe, especially Italy. Here you see statistical data about the 982 refugees who were selected to come to Fort Ontario's safe haven in Oswego. Refugees from the Holocaust had to apply for sanctuary in the United States. Nearly 3,000 refugees applied to come to the United States. To be accepted, refugees had to have assisted in the Allied war effort, or lost relatives in the Holocaust, or had family members in the United States, or had skills useful to help run the refugee shelter. You will note that the vast majority were Jews, including 2 rabbis. Most spoke more than one language, in addition to their mother tongue. But this is so extensively true of Europeans. These 982 refugees were transported on this transport ship, the Henry Gibbons, which set sail on July 20th, 1944 from Naples, Italy. The ship also carried wounded U.S. soldiers being brought back to the United States. On board the ship it was very crowded conditions. The refugees slept 3 high in canvas bunks. They ate their meals frequently standing up. On the voyage, a young baby died the night before the ship landed in New York City, apparently because of malnutrition and pneumonia. Several other refugee passengers became ill as a result of the voyage. The refugees were issued tags labeled, quote, U.S. Army casual baggage, unquote, and were assigned identification numbers. The United States government sent Dr. Ruth Gruber to Italy to accompany the refugees on their transport to the Oswego facility. The refugees were surprised to see that this special representative of the U.S. government was a female, but they were relieved to see her wearing the Jewish star. Undoubtedly, Ruth Gruber played a major role in assisting these refugees. This picture gives you an idea of how crowded it was on the open deck of the ship for all those passengers crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The ship docked in Manhattan early evening, August 3rd, 1944. The refugees were detained on the ship overnight. The next morning, the refugees were subjected to a disinfestation process. The chemicals used were so strong that the chemicals destroyed the worn clothing of a number of the refugees. Then the refugees were placed on ferry boats in the North River and remained on the ferry boats until the evening. Then the ferry boats took them to Hoboken, New Jersey, where the refugees were put onto day coaches of the train that would take them overnight to Oswego. Here you see a few of the refugees disembarking from the train after arriving in Oswego early on the morning of Saturday, August 5th, 1944. Look carefully at the facial smiles of the two refugees in the center. Their smiles to me look more like smiles of hope rather than smiles of relief. As is written on page 28 of the book Token Shipment, quote, "For the refugees, the long journey was over. Their future was still in doubt, but for the present at least, they had a secure haven out of reach of the bombs." Each refugee had an ID tag to wear, as shown for this refugee. Here are 4 visuals of the refugees being checked in at Safe Haven. Here are some refugees with their luggage. Note the letters on the wall of the building. Those letters probably identified the first letter of the last name. At this welcoming center, the refugees were told by the shelter director that, quote, "Whenever there is a knock on your door, it will be a friendly one." Here you see the refugees in line to get a towel and a bar of soap. Remember that many of the refugees at Safe Haven were children. In the 2 large pictures, top left and bottom right, you see visuals of children with Army personnel at Safe Haven. In the picture at upper right, you see a father and daughter, both clearly smiling. At lower left, you see a happy young boy who has just received a pair of shoes. Initially, all meals were provided to the refugees in the mess halls. Eventually, each apartment had an electric stove on which typically one of the daily meals was cooked. Shown here in the large picture are the 2-story former soldiers' barracks that were converted into apartments. The picture at lower right shows a number of these wooden barracks. This map shows the property of the Fort Ontario complex. The buildings to house the Safe Haven refugees were the wooden buildings that had been soldiers' barracks. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt made a visit to Safe Haven on September 20th, 1944. We have to assume that she certainly lobbied her husband to get this refugee shelter. The shelter residents were in a fenced-in area. Although this was for security reasons, residents of Oswego could interact with the shelter residents at the fence, as shown in this visual. Most meals were eaten in a common dining hall. Eventually, the family apartments had an electric stove so that the family could have at least one meal a day cooked at their apartment. This shows how 193 refugee children went to Oswego public schools. As the caption says, many of these students had not been in classrooms for as much as 5 or 6 years. Some of the shelter residents wanted to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces, but the War Department wouldn't allow this. Several of the shelter residents had special talents, such as musical talents. Here is Mac Sipser, who did many caricatures for the shelter newspaper called the Ontario Chronicle. To try to answer the question, how were the shelter residents treated, let me say that they were treated much better than they would have been treated had they become prisoners of the Nazis. However, they did not have the rights of Americans in that they were kept within a fenced-in area. I have highlighted in red a quote made by one of the shelter residents who used the words, quote, fairy tale kind of life, unquote, for these Holocaust refugees, each of which had encountered the Holocaust personally. As part of the deal to bring them to a refugee shelter in the United States, these Holocaust refugees had agreed to return to their homeland after the war. The reality was that many of these refugees didn't want to return to their homeland. After all, for many, their homeland area had been largely destroyed in the war. Just think of what you're seeing now with regards to Ukrainian refugees. While the U.S. War Relocation Authority was deciding what to do with these guests of the President of the United States, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which had been established in 1943, provided for those who wanted to go back to Yugoslavia to do so, and 53 did. As the War Relocation Authority continued to decide what to do, the shelter residents formed their National Board of Fort Ontario Residents to, in effect, lobby on their own behalf. On September 14, 1945, representatives of the State Department and the Justice Department of the United States government came to Safe Haven to talk with shelter residents. Finally, just 3 days before Christmas 1945, President Truman issued a directive that these refugees could remain in the United States if that is what they wanted to do. Of course, the overwhelming majority of the shelter residents wanted to remain in the United States. However, the Safe Haven residents who wanted to remain in the United States had to go first to Canada to secure visas to come back into the United States by immigration laws. The group of about 100 who left Safe Haven on January 17, 1946 are shown here. Other refugees groups of about that size left the shelter on alternate days. The size of 100 per day was the limit that the consulate at Niagara Falls, Canada could handle each day. There were 23 babies born at Safe Haven, and these babies were determined to be U.S. citizens and thus didn't have to get visas to come into the United States as immigrants. This panel at the Safe Haven Museum shows where in the United States these refugees went before the Safe Haven facility finally closed in February of 1946. I hope that if you haven't already done so, that you will want to visit the Safe Haven Holocaust Refugee Shelter Museum and learn a great deal more about the shelter residents who were there. This museum will enable you to learn much more than what I'm saying in this program. The museum has many artifacts and provides specific information about several of the refugees at Safe Haven. A visit to this Safe Haven Holocaust Refugee Shelter Museum, along with visiting historic Fort Ontario itself, would be a fine day trip for Finger Lakes residents. As some summary comments, let me first point out that Safe Haven in Oswego, New York, was the only Holocaust shelter established in the United States during World War II. The Franklin Roosevelt administration, especially President Franklin Roosevelt himself, contemplated creating other such refugee shelters, but it didn't happen. A total of 982 Holocaust refugees were selected out of about 3,000 applicants. Most, but certainly not all, were Jewish. Because of the very restrictive immigration legislation at the time, President Roosevelt said these refugees would come to the United States as guests of the president. He also told Congress that these refugees had agreed to return to their homeland after the war in Europe was over. However, most of the shelter residents decided to stay in the United States when President Truman gave them that option. To exercise that option, however, the shelter residents were bused to the consulate of the United States in Niagara Falls, Canada, to be processed to receive a visa to come into the United States. I hope that you have enjoyed learning about this Safe Haven Holocaust Refugee Museum, which is another piece of our Finger Lakes history. But before I close, I do want to acknowledge that many of the visuals and detailed information for my program came from the two sources listed here.